There is still uncertainty and confusion tonight about when U.S. tariffs on Canadian imports will take effect, if at all. Donald Trump raised hopes for another pause today, but a White House official is sticking to the original deadline of Tuesday. Richard Madden joins us from Washington and take us through what we actually know at this point.
Yeah, so that's a bit of a tricky one, Ian, because what we got today is that the Trump administration essentially revealed a new target date to implement those punishing 25% tariffs on all Canadian imports, initially set for next week. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick is now saying it could be delayed for another month. And all this adds yet another layer to the confusion and mixed messages we're getting from the White House. This all started a month ago, you'll recall, when Trump first threatened 25% tariffs as leverage that forced Canada to strengthen its northern border and stop the flow of fentanyl. But then Trump agreed to pause them to give Canada more time to take action. We saw Ottawa scrambling, boosting military spending, introducing policies to strengthen the border, and the appointment of a new fentanyl czar. But Canadian officials complained it was unclear if those measures satisfied the White House demands. And adding to the confusion, on Monday, Trump said he's lifting the pause and these tariffs will be moving ahead as scheduled early next month. Then yesterday, the White House clarified, saying no, the president was referring to different tariffs. So now, Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick gave a bit of clarity and somewhat of a blueprint on what it would take for the Canadians to avoid the onset of this first round of tariffs. Watch.
We have the fentanyl-related is a pause. If they can prove to the president they've done an excellent job, that's what they first do in 30 days. But then the overall is April 2nd. So the big transaction is April 2nd, but the fentanyl-related things, they're working hard on the border. At the end of that 30 days, they have to prove to the president that they've satisfied him to that regard. If they have, then he'll give them a pause, or he won't. But
It's going to be hard to satisfy. We lose 300,000 people a year to fentanyl.
Okay, so if you're following that, it would suggest that if the administration is satisfied by Canada's actions, those 25% tariffs could be delayed until April 2nd, or maybe not. Because if you're losing track of all these different types of tariffs and dates they take effect, it could be by design. Some might call it the art of the deal. Now, Trump has threatened a whole stack of tariffs against Canada and its allies. So here are some dates to keep in mind, Ian, and we're going to do this a bit old school, okay, with the old school calendar. So first and foremost, the border fentanyl tariffs. These were initially set to kick in on March the 4th. We heard Howard Lutnick saying that might be delayed for another month. And then a week later, on March the 12th, we've got the steel and aluminum tariffs that are set to be implemented. And that's also the on April the 2nd, rather, this is the tariff on all imported vehicles. So you got the 4th, that's been delayed, the 12th, that could still happen, and then, of course, the 2nd on all imported vehicles. And, of course, the White House is looking at other reciprocal tariffs, digital services, and then possible tariffs on copper, where Canada, of course, is one of the biggest suppliers to the U.S. So there's a lot of tariffs to keep track of, but this first round, this 25%, appears, if you listen to Howard Lutnick, it appears to be delayed for another month.
The tariffs will make it impossible for them to sell cars into the United States. The tariffs will make it impossible for them to sell lumber or anything else into the United States. And all I'm asking to do is break even or lose a little bit, but not lose $200 billion. And we love Canada. I love Canada. I love the people of Canada. And but honestly, it's not fair for us to be supporting Canada. And if we don't support them, they don't subsist as a nation.
So here's a concern with that. If you slap tariffs on lumber, cars, and possibly steel, this gets complicated since those imports are theoretically protected under the modernized free trade agreement, USMCA or NAFTA 2.0, that Trump himself signed in his first term. So the Commerce Secretary may be playing good cop, signaling he's willing to keep the lines open, while President Trump is casting himself as the tough guy, wielding those brass knuckles of trade tariffs, creating, of course, more uncertainty and straining Canada-U.S. relations.
All right, Richard, thank you. Let's bring in Brian Kingston, president of the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association. And Brian, there seems to be confusion here. How are you handling all of this?
Well, it is creating mass uncertainty in the industry. You know, if you look back to 2020, we've seen well over $200 billion invested into automotive across North America. And that's all been on the basis of the trade agreement that we have that allows for an integrated North American supply chain. All of that is now in question because we have these constant tariff threats. So it creates uncertainty and it makes it hard for investments to move forward.
So what, I just can't even imagine how you and your member groups can proceed here. Are you treating this April 2nd date as the actual date the tariffs will be imposed?
Well, we have to because the risk associated with these tariffs is so high that we have to plan for the worst outcome. Just to give you an example of how significant this would be for the industry, the U.S. sends over $20 billion in vehicles to Canada every year. Canada is the biggest market for U.S. vehicle exports by far. And for Canada, over 92% of what we build here goes to the United States. So we have to take these threats seriously, even if the dates are shifting, because the implications are just so significant and so negative.
I would assume that when you have these big automakers with a real stake in smooth travel for parts and cars back and forth across the border, that they would certainly want to do everything they can to lobby the president to get rid of these tariffs or delay them for a long time. Is that happening? I assume that's happening behind closed doors.
Absolutely. Automakers have been making the case to the U.S. administration, obviously working very closely with governments in Canada and Mexico, to just remind how important this industry is, how many people it employs, and how integrated it is. We see a lot of commentary out of the United States about an unfair or unbalanced trade relationship. Well, in automotive, the U.S. has a trade surplus with Canada. They send more to Canada than we send to the States. So the relationship actually works very well, and it works very well for America. So we've got to keep making that case to the administration and make sure that they understand the serious negative impacts of proceeding down this road of tariffs.
I know a lot of people in Canada have been wondering if various industries can look, at countries other than the United States for their products, try to diversify to lessen the shock here. Is that something your members realistically can do, especially in a short time frame?
In automotive, that is simply not possible. The reason is because we've created a very north-south supply chain, and that really goes back to the 1960s when we had the Auto Pact. All of our exports end up going to the United States. If you look at the vehicles that are built in Canada, over 50% of the parts and components in them are from America. So it's totally integrated on a north-south basis, and it's not possible to say, well, let's look at Asia, let's look at Europe. That's just not how the industry works. So we've got to get this right, and we have to make sure that we continue to have this integrated supply chain, or this industry will be challenged.
Last question, maybe if you can answer in about half a minute. If Canadians, not in your industry, but average Canadians, are getting kind of tired and maybe desensitized to all these tariff deadlines and kind of go, wake me up when it's all over, what would you say to them?
Look, I can appreciate that sentiment, because it seems as though not a day passes where you don't have a new tariff threat or a shifting date. But we have to take this seriously because it is just simply too important for the Canadian economy. If you look at trade as a percent of our GDP, it's almost 3/4. We depend on trade. Our prosperity depends on trade. We've got to get this relationship right, and we've got to find a way to make it work with the Trump administration.
Yeah, well, big issue, obviously, that will affect a lot of Canadians. I appreciate you making the time for us this evening. Brian, thank you.
Thanks for having me on.